by all accounts, I was doing well. I had a management position at a marketing firm, a nice apartment, and a life that looked exactly like it was supposed to. I was a high-functioning professional. But on the inside, I was in a constant, silent state of emergency. It started small, a tightness in my chest during a crowded commute. Then it became a racing heart during a team meeting. Soon, the panic attacks were a daily, crippling event. I'd be sitting at my desk, looking at a spreadsheet, and suddenly the numbers would blur. My vision would narrow to a pinprick. My own breathing would sound deafeningly loud in my ears, but I could never seem to get enough air. I felt like I was drowning in a perfectly quiet, air-conditioned office. I started calling in sick, making excuses, hiding in the bathroom when I felt one coming on. My world was shrinking, and I was terrified I was going to lose everything I'd worked for. I finally broke down and made an appointment with a doctor. I remember sitting on the crinkly paper of the examination table, my hands shaking as I tried to explain the terror. He listened, nodding, but seemed almost detached. He told me it was a classic case of panic disorder, a chemical imbalance. He said they had wonderful modern medications for this now. He wrote a prescription for something called Klonopin. He held up the script like it was a winning lottery ticket. He told me it was safe, non-habit forming, and would work quickly. He called it a miracle for people like me. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me cry. A miracle. That's all I wanted. A way out. I walked out of that office feeling more hopeful than I had in years. I went straight to the pharmacy and got the prescription filled. Back in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the tiny white pill in the palm of my hand. It looked so harmless, so small to hold back such a huge, terrifying monster. With trembling fingers, I put the pill in my mouth and washed it down with a glass of water. I waited. For 20 minutes, nothing. The familiar tension was still coiling in my stomach. I thought, maybe it doesn't work. And then, it began. It wasn't a rush or a high. It was a slow, beautiful fade to silence. The frantic looping thoughts in my head just stopped. The tight band around my chest loosened. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized were bunched up to my ears, finally dropped. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my mind was quiet. It was the most profound peace I had ever felt. I took a deep, easy breath. This was it, I thought. This was the beginning of my recovery. I was finally going to be okay. For the first couple of months, it was a miracle. That profound quiet from the first pill became my new normal. Every morning I'd take my Klonopin with my coffee, and within half an hour, the world would smooth out. The silent state of emergency was over. I could handle the crowded commute. I could sit through meetings without feeling like the walls were closing in. I was productive at work. I was myself again. The monster was back in its cage, and I had the key. But then, the quiet started to wear off sooner. At first, I barely noticed it. Around 4 p.m., I'd just feel a little more on edge. Then, it became a definite, physical thing. My heart would start beating a little too fast. That old, familiar tightness would return to my chest. The monster was rattling the bars of its cage, and it sounded angry. Soon, my entire afternoon became a brutal waiting game. It was a new kind of terror. This wasn't just the memory of panic. This was a physical, gnawing dread that started around lunchtime and grew worse with every passing hour. I'd stare at the clock, my leg bouncing under my desk, trying to look normal while my whole body was screaming. It felt like holding my breath underwater. I'd taste metal in my mouth. My hands would get clammy. It was withdrawal. I didn't call it that then, but I knew what it was. It was a horrible, desperate need for the pill that would make it all stop. I went back to the same doctor. I tried to explain the afternoons, the clock watching, the dread that was somehow worse than the original anxiety. He listened with that same detached look on his face. He told me it wasn't withdrawal. He said my brain chemistry was still unbalanced and that my body had simply built up a tolerance. It was a common hurdle, he explained. Nothing to worry about. His solution was simple. He just increased the dosage. He wrote me a new prescription, doubling the dose I was on. He said this would be enough to last the whole day. Walking out of his office, I didn't feel that wave of hope from the first time. There was just a grim, desperate relief. I went straight to the pharmacy. I took the first of the new, stronger pills right there in my car in the parking lot. The quiet returned, deeper this time. But I knew, somewhere deep down, that this wasn't a cure anymore. It was just a heavier lock on a bigger cage. For a few years, that heavier lock held. The doubled dose kept the quiet in place, and I rebuilt a life on top of it. I got promotions at work. I functioned. My days were structured around the prescription. One pill in the morning to start the day, another in the evening to be able to sleep. It was a fragile, chemically maintained peace, but it was peace. My life depended on that little amber bottle. Then one day, everything changed. I went to the office for my regular 3-month check-in, the appointment I had made like clockwork for years. But my doctor wasn't there. The receptionist, a woman I'd known since my first visit, told me he had retired. Suddenly, he'd sold the practice and was just gone. She told me I would be seeing the new physician. When he walked into the room, he looked younger than me. He didn't make eye contact. He just opened my file and started flipping through the pages, his mouth set in a thin, tight line. He didn't ask how I was, or what was going on in my life. The silence in the room was heavy and judgmental. Finally, he closed the folder and looked straight at me. His eyes were cold. "I've reviewed your history," he said. "You've been on a dangerously high dose of a benzodiazepine for almost 5 years. This practice is not going to continue enabling a dependency. We can't carry that liability." I started to talk, my voice already shaking. I tried to explain about the panic attacks, about how I was just following the old doctor's orders, about how I couldn't function without it. He held up a hand to stop me. "I've heard it all before," he said. "It's classic drug-seeking behavior." The words felt like a physical blow. He wasn't seeing a patient. He was seeing a file, a risk, an addict. I begged him. I tried to explain what happened when the dose wore off, the interdose withdrawal that felt like I was dying. I told him a rapid taper was dangerous, that it could cause seizures. He was completely unmoved. "The protocol is non-negotiable," he said, already scribbling on a prescription pad. "We're cutting your dose by 75%, effective immediately. You'll get a 1-month prescription at that level. Then you can come back and we'll see about the rest." He called it discomfort. He said I should expect some discomfort as my body adjusted. I knew it wouldn't be discomfort. It was going to be hell. He pushed the prescription across the desk. I took the piece of paper, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. I walked out of that office in a total fog. He hadn't just cut my dose. He had just pulled the pin on a grenade and handed it to me. The discomfort the doctor talked about began that first night. It wasn't the familiar, gnawing dread of the interdose withdrawal I knew so well. This was a complete, systemic failure. I couldn't sleep. My body was vibrating, a deep, internal tremor that made my teeth ache. I lay in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it would break them. It felt like every cell in my body was screaming for something it had been denied. The next day, the grenade went off. The world became a weapon. Every sound was a physical assault. My husband dropped a spoon in the kitchen, and the sound hit me like a punch to the jaw. I flinched, my whole body seizing up. The hum of the refrigerator was a deafening, malicious roar. I had to stuff cotton balls in my ears just to survive inside my own apartment. Light was even worse. The morning sun coming through the blinds felt like white-hot needles stabbing into my eyes. I pulled all the shades down, put on sunglasses indoors, and still, every sliver of light was an agony. I spent hours sitting in our windowless bathroom, just sitting on the floor in the dark with the fan off, because it was the only place that didn't feel like it was actively trying to kill me. But the real hell wasn't the sound or the light. It was what happened to my mind. The world started to dissolve. I would be walking down the hallway of my own home, a hallway I had walked down 1,000 times, and suddenly I wouldn't know where I was. The walls would seem too far away, or the ceiling too high. It looked like my apartment, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like a strange, hostile replica. The worst moment came that first week. I stumbled out of the bathroom after hiding for hours. My husband was standing by the window. He turned to look at me, his face full of concern, and I had no idea who he was. My mind was a complete and total blank. All I saw was a stranger, a man standing in my house, and I was filled with a terror so pure and so absolute that I couldn't even scream. I just stared at him, my heart stopped. Who are you? Where am I? The thoughts were a silent shriek inside my head. It only lasted for maybe 30 seconds. Then, like a camera lens snapping into focus, his face became familiar again. It was my husband. This was my home. But the memory of that terror, that feeling of being completely and utterly lost in my own life, didn't go away. It stayed, a cold dread in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't discomfort. This was the unraveling of reality itself. That cold dread never left. It was a permanent resident now. I spent the next few days in that state of unraveling, moving through my apartment like a ghost, terrified of sounds, light, and my own mind. My husband tried to help, but I couldn't explain what was happening. How do you tell someone you looked at them and saw a stranger? How do you say that reality itself feels like it's coming apart at the seams? The final break happened on the 10th day of the taper. I was standing in the kitchen, trying to drink a glass of water, but my hands were shaking too badly. I remember staring at the water sloshing over the sides of the glass. Then a strange chemical taste flooded my mouth, like sucking on a battery. My field of vision began to shrink, and a high-pitched ringing started in my ears, getting louder and louder until it was the only thing in the universe. My body wasn't mine anymore. My jaw clamped shut with incredible force. My back arched, a violent, unnatural spasm that threw me backwards. I remember the side of my head hitting the kitchen tile. I remember my limbs jerking and thrashing against the floor. I was aware of it all, but I was just a passenger in a body that was trying to tear itself apart. And then, there was just blackness. The next thing I remember is the ceiling, a white water-stained acoustic tile ceiling. The fluorescent light above me was buzzing, but the sound was muted, distant. I was in a hospital bed. I could feel an IV line tugging at the back of my hand and the rough texture of the hospital gown against my skin. The sensory hell from before was gone, replaced by a dull, exhausted blankness. My husband was asleep in a chair next to the bed, his face pale and drawn. I just stared at the ceiling, too tired to feel anything. A neurologist came to see me later that day. He was a kind, tired-looking man who spoke in a quiet voice. He had my chart. He told me what I already knew. I'd had a grand mal seizure. He confirmed, without any doubt, that it was caused by the rapid, massive reduction in my Klonopin dose. He called it medically indefensible. For a second, I felt a wave of validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't just experiencing discomfort. But then he kept talking. He said they had done an MRI and a series of cognitive tests while I was still groggy. He looked down at his chart, then back at me. His kind eyes were now full of pity. He told me that years of high-dose benzodiazepine use, capped off by the shock of the withdrawal, had left a mark. He said there were signs of neurological impairment, brain damage. He explained what it meant in simple terms. My short-term memory would be unreliable. My ability to process information would be slower. The quiet, efficient mind I had before the panic attack started, the mind I took the pills to get back, was gone. The miracle cure for my manageable anxiety had left me with a permanent injury. To even get off the drugs safely now, he said, would require a painstakingly slow, liquid taper. It would take at least a year of hell just to reclaim some small fraction of the person I used to be. The panic attacks were gone, sure, but so was I. My prison was a small, amber-colored bottle. For the better part of a decade, my days were planned around a prescription for oxycodone. It started with a bad back injury, but that was ancient history. Now, it was just maintenance. One pill in the morning to stop the shaking, another in the afternoon so I wouldn't have to leave work early. I was a functioning addict. But the fear was a constant companion. The fear of the pharmacy being closed, of the doctor questioning my refill, of running out. I knew I had to get off. I wanted my life back. But the one time I tried to quit on my own, it was pure agony. It's hard to describe opiate withdrawal if you haven't felt it. It's not just being dope sick. It's your bones aching with a deep, liquid cold. It's your skin crawling, every nerve ending screaming. It's restless leg syndrome in your entire body, a desperate, frantic need to move that has no release. You can't sleep, you can't eat, and your mind is a loop of pure terror and self-hatred. I lasted 2 days before I was on the phone, begging my doctor for an early refill, crying and saying I'd lost the bottle. The sickness was a beast I knew I couldn't fight. So one night, drowning in that familiar shame and desperation, I was on my computer. I typed "how to stop taking opiates without withdrawal" into the search bar. I went down a rabbit hole of forums and recovery blogs. Most of it was the usual stuff. Tapering plans that would take a year, expensive rehab facilities, brutal detox stories that made my stomach clench. It all felt hopeless. Then I started seeing a new word pop up everywhere. Kratom. Post after post, testimonial after testimonial. People were calling it a miracle. An all-natural herb from Southeast Asia that completely stopped withdrawal symptoms. I spent the next 4 hours reading stories from people just like me. Long-term pain pill users who had switched to this green powder and just stopped. They said there were no withdrawals from the opiates. They said the kratom itself was non-addictive, like coffee. It felt like I had found a secret escape hatch. It wasn't a clinic, it wasn't another doctor, it wasn't a year of misery. It was a plant. The stories were so convincing. A gift from God. The off-ramp I was praying for. I found a website that sold it. a slick-looking place with dozens of different strains and glowing reviews. I pulled out my credit card. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of real hope. This was it. This was how I was going to get my life back without having to face the beast. The package arrived 2 days later. By then, the withdrawal was already setting in. That familiar cold sweat, the ache deep in my bones. I ripped open the mailer and found a vacuum-sealed bag of fine, dark green powder. It smelled like cut grass and dirt. Following the advice from the forums, I measured out 5 grams on a digital scale, mixed it into a glass of orange juice, and chugged it down. The grit was awful. It was like drinking swamp water. I sat on my couch, my legs twitching, my stomach churning, and waited for the miracle. And then it happened. It wasn't a rush or a high. It was a slow, quiet turning off of a switch. After about 20 minutes, I realized the restless ache in my legs was just gone. The cold sweat had dried up. The knot of anxiety in my stomach had untied itself. It was the most bizarre feeling. I wasn't high. I just felt normal. The beast of withdrawal, the agony I was so terrified of, had been completely and totally silenced by a spoonful of powdered leaves. I almost cried from the relief. I was free. I had found the escape hatch. At first, it was perfect. I took 5 grams in the morning and 5 in the evening. Life went on. I flushed my last few oxycodone pills down the toilet and didn't look back. For a few weeks, I was a walking advertisement for Kratom. I was myself again, without the fear, without the pills. But then, the escape hatch started to shrink. Soon, 5 grams wasn't enough to keep the beast away for the whole morning. I'd start feeling that familiar chill creep into my back around 11 a.m. The solution was simple. I just took a little more. 7 grams, then 10. My 2 doses a day became 3, then 4. Before I knew it, I wasn't measuring it out anymore. I was just taking a heaping tablespoon every 2 or 3 hours, chugging down the green sludge like it was water. I was terrified of what would happen if I stopped. My use spiraled completely out of control. My life became a constant, desperate cycle of dosing. Wake up sick, chug Kratom. Feel the sickness creep back in 2 hours later, chug more Kratom. I was ordering kilos of the stuff online every week. It went from a few grams a day to 50, then 60, then at my worst, over 100 grams of powder a day. 100 grams. My all-natural, non-addictive miracle cure was now costing me more money, more time, and more of my soul than my pill habit ever had. I hadn't found an off-ramp. I had just merged onto a faster, more destructive highway. The turning point came about 2 months into my 100-gram-a-day habit. I had a mandatory marketing conference in a city 500 miles from home. The thought of traveling was terrifying. Not because of the flight or the conference, but because of the logistics of the addiction. I couldn't just bring a few pills. I had to bring a huge, suspicious-looking bag of green powder. I measured out what I thought was enough for 4 days, plus extra for emergencies, and packed it all into a large freezer bag at the bottom of my suitcase. I made it to the hotel. I remember the relief I felt when I shut the door to my room, finally alone. The first dose of the day was wearing off, and the familiar clammy feeling was starting on my skin. I was exhausted from the travel and the constant anxiety. I put my suitcase on the luggage rack and unzipped it. I was clumsy, in a hurry to get my dose. I reached in to grab the bag of Kratom, but my fingers fumbled. The bag slipped from my grasp. It hit the sharp corner of the wooden desk on its way down. The plastic tore open. The bag landed on the floor, and a huge, dark green cloud erupted into the air. It was like a bomb of dust and plant matter had gone off in the small hotel room. The powder settled everywhere. It was a fine green film on the cheap carpet, on my business suits, all over the bedspread. The whole room instantly smelled of swampy, bitter tea. I just stood there, staring at the green disaster on the floor. My entire supply, every last gram. My heart didn't just drop. It felt like it completely ceased to exist. A cold, electric shock of pure panic shot through my body. I was 500 miles from home. There was no head shop on the corner I could run to. My online vendors took 3 days to ship, minimum. There was no one to call. I had nothing. I was completely, utterly stranded. After the first wave of terror passed, I tried to think. I told myself to be rational. I had been through opiate withdrawal before. I knew what it was. The aches, the chills, the restless legs. It felt like a horrible flu. It was agony, but it wasn't going to kill me. This was just kratom, an herb. I thought, okay, this is forced. This is my chance. It'll be a few days of hell, but I can do this. I'll call work and say I have food poisoning. I'll just sweat it out here in this room. I had been through withdrawal. I thought I knew what I was in for. I had absolutely no idea. The first few hours were eerily quiet. I lay in the hotel bed, bracing for the familiar agony. I waited for the bone-deep aches, the chills, the sweats. I knew that fight. It was a brutal, physical war. But the hours passed, and it didn't come. I felt a flicker of stupid, impossible hope. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Then it started. It wasn't an ache. It was a vibration. A low electric hum deep inside my muscles and bones. It was a frantic, unbearable restlessness. I couldn't lie down. I couldn't sit. I couldn't stand still. I had to move. I paced the tiny hotel room, from the door to the window, back and forth, over and over. But the pacing gave no relief. It felt like I was trying to run away from my own skeleton. My skin was crawling, and I wanted to tear it off. I wanted to scream, but I was too wired, too full of this horrible, frantic energy. And with the restlessness came a feeling I can't properly describe. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't panic. It was a sense of impending doom so absolute and so profound that it felt like a fact. It was a certainty. A piece of information downloaded directly into my brain that something terrible and world-ending was about to happen. Not that I might die, but that death would be a relief from whatever was coming. The air in the room felt heavy, charged, and hostile. The psychological horror was the worst part. Every sound was a threat. The hum of the ice machine down the hall was a malicious whisper. A door closing somewhere on the floor was a gunshot. I became convinced there were people in the hallway, talking about me, waiting for me. I'd press my ear to the door, my heart hammering, trying to hear them. Then I'd jump back, terrified they could hear me breathing. My own mind was turning into a torture chamber. This was nothing like opiate withdrawal. That was pure physical misery, a body screaming for a chemical it needs. It's hell, but it's a hell you understand. This was different. This was not my body screaming. This was my soul being peeled away from my bones. I had wished for death during opiate withdrawal. Now, I was in a state of terror so complete that my biggest fear was that I wouldn't be allowed to die. I don't know how long I paced that room, a prisoner trapped between the door and the window. The terrifying, frantic energy just kept building. The hum in my bones was getting louder, vibrating through my whole body. Then, a new sensation. It was a taste. A sharp, metallic tang that flooded my mouth like I was chewing on aluminum foil. The edges of my vision started flashing with little strobing lights. The room began to tilt, slowly at first, and then everything was just spinning. I remember thinking, I need to lie down. I tried to move toward the bed, but my legs wouldn't obey. My jaw slammed shut so hard, I felt a crack in my teeth. My head snapped back, and my whole body went rigid. I was aware of falling, but I couldn't feel the impact. I just felt my limbs start to jerk and slam against the floor, completely out of my control. I was a spectator watching my own body thrash and convulse in the green-dusted carpet. Then the world just shut off. The next thing I remember is light. A single, unbearably bright, fluorescent light right above my eyes. There was a steady, rhythmic beeping somewhere to my right. I felt a thick, exhausted fog in my head, like I'd been asleep for 100 years. I tried to sit up, to shield my eyes from the light, but my arm wouldn't move. I tried again. It was strapped down. I pulled with my other arm. That one was strapped down too. A thick leather restraint was buckled around each of my wrists, tying me to the bed rails. A cold wave of pure, disoriented panic washed through the fog. Where was I? Why was I tied down? A doctor came into my field of view. He looked tired. He had a clipboard. He asked me if I knew my name. I managed to croak it out. He asked if I knew where I was. I just shook my head. He told me I was in the hospital. He said the hotel cleaning staff had found me on the floor. I'd had a severe grand mal seizure. He kept asking me what I had taken. Heroin? Fentanyl? I told him no, nothing like that. I tried to explain about the kratom. It's an herb, I kept saying, my voice raspy and weak. From a plant. He just stared at me with a blank, skeptical look. He told me they had run a full toxicology screen. It came back completely clean. No opiates, no benzodiazepines, no amphetamines, nothing. As far as they were concerned, my seizure had no cause. They didn't know what kratom was, and they didn't believe it could do this. I was just a man who had a violent, unexplained seizure in a hotel room 500 miles from home. The safe cure, the all-natural escape hatch that was supposed to save me from the beast of addiction, had revealed itself. It was a new beast, one that nobody understood, and it had brought me closer to death than the opiates ever had. By the time I was 27, my life had been almost completely erased by social anxiety. It wasn't just nerves. It was a physical, suffocating terror. My career, which had just started, was the first casualty. I quit a decent job because I couldn't handle the daily terror of the open plan office. The casual conversations in the break room, the feeling of eyes on my back. My friends slowly drifted away, tired of me canceling plans at the last minute with flimsy excuses. Eventually, I couldn't even go to the grocery store. The simple act of making eye contact with a cashier felt like a high-stakes confrontation that would leave me shaking and sweating for hours afterward. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my apartment. I was a ghost in my own life. I had tried everything. Years of therapy that just felt like paying someone to watch me squirm. A long list of SSRIs that did nothing for the fear but flattened every other emotion, turning my life from sharp terror to a dull, gray fog. I was at the end of my rope. I had accepted that this was it, that I would just slowly fade away in my little apartment until I disappeared completely. One night, in that familiar state of total hopelessness, I was scrolling through forums deep in the corners of the internet. I wasn't even looking for anything specific anymore, just reading stories from other people who were trapped like me. Then I saw a word I'd never seen before. Phenibut. It wasn't being talked about like a drug. It was called a nootropic, a research chemical. Post after post, story after story, people were describing a miracle. They weren't just saying it made them less anxious. They said it gave them effortless charisma. They said it made them witty, outgoing, the life of the party. It completely and utterly erased social fear, replacing it with a warm, glowing confidence. And the best part? It was legal. A dietary supplement you could order online with a credit card, no prescription needed. It was a loophole. I spent the rest of the night obsessed, reading hundreds of testimonials. Each one was a story from someone who sounded just like me, someone whose life was a prison, who had found the key. It felt like I had stumbled upon a secret that could save my life. I found a professional-looking website selling it in clean-looking tubs of white powder. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was hope. A desperate, electric hope I hadn't felt in a decade. This was it. This was my last chance. I wasn't just buying a chemical. I was buying a new life. The package arrived 2 days later. It was a clean white tub with a professional-looking label. Inside was a fine, crystalline white powder, the key to my new life. I measured out the recommended dose from the forums, 1 gram, and mixed it into a glass of water. It tasted sour and chemical, but I barely noticed. I was waiting for the miracle, and the miracle came. About an hour later, I was sitting on my couch, and I realized something was different. The constant buzzing static of fear in my head was gone. It wasn't a high, not like being drunk or stoned. It was an absence. The tight, suffocating knot that had lived in my chest for a decade had simply dissolved. I went outside. I walked down the street and made eye contact with a stranger, and nothing happened. I felt a warm, quiet, unshakable confidence. For the first time I could remember, I felt normal. Better than normal. I felt invincible. That first month was a blur of incredible, impossible success. The Phenibut didn't just remove my anxiety. It replaced it with a smooth, effortless charisma. I applied for jobs, and I walked into interviews with a smile. I wasn't scared. I was articulate, I was witty, I was charming. The words just flowed. I got a job, a great one. My old friends, who I hadn't seen in years, were amazed. I was suddenly the guy suggesting we go out, the one cracking jokes in the middle of a crowded bar, the life of the party. I even met a woman and asked her out without a second thought. My life, the one I had bought online, was perfect. But the confidence was borrowed, and the interest rates were brutal. At first, 1 dose in the morning would last all day. Then, after a few weeks, I started to feel the magic wear off in the evening. It wasn't a gentle return to my old self. It was a crash, a horrible, jarring plunge into a state of anxiety far worse than anything I'd ever known. A frantic, paranoid, skin-crawling terror. They called it rebound on the forums. It was pure hell. The only thing that stopped it was another dose. My use quickly became a desperate, defensive pattern. I wasn't taking it to feel good anymore. I was taking it to stop feeling absolutely, inhumanly terrible. My single morning dose became 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening. Then the doses had to get bigger. 1 gram became 2. 2 became 3. I was taking it every 6 hours, just to keep the rebound at bay. I was no longer a prisoner in my apartment. I was a prisoner to a small plastic tub of white powder, and the walls of the cell were shrinking every single day. My new life ran on a 6-hour clock. The first thing I did when I woke up wasn't check my phone or make coffee. It was to dose. I had to, because I was already late. That warm, glowing confidence was a distant memory. The phenibut wasn't for charisma anymore. It was a shield. And if that shield dropped for even an hour, the world became a place of absolute horror. The rebound was nothing like my old anxiety. This wasn't a fear of people. This was a fear of existence itself. If a dose was even 30 minutes late, it would begin. A low, electric hum would start behind my eyes. I'd get a strange metallic taste in my mouth. A cold sweat would break out on my neck, and not from heat. It was the feeling of my nervous system starting to short-circuit, a biological alarm bell screaming that something was desperately, chemically wrong. If I was a few hours late, my mind would completely break from reality. I wouldn't just feel anxious. I'd become severely paranoid. The sound of the wind would sound like people whispering my name just outside the window. Any stranger I saw on the street looked menacing, like they knew me, like they were following me. Faces would look subtly wrong. The world would feel thin, like a movie set that was about to be torn down. It was a state of pure, chemically induced psychosis, and it was 10 times more terrifying than any panic attack I'd ever had. So my whole existence became about feeding the clock. I set alarms on my phone for every 6 hours. 7 a.m., 1 p.m., 7 p.m., 1 a.m. I could never go anywhere or do anything that might prevent me from dosing on time. Movies were out. Long dinners were impossible. I carried a little plastic baggie of the white powder with me everywhere, tucked in my coin pocket like a shameful secret. I was a slave to a timer. The prison of my apartment had been replaced by a much smaller, more terrifying prison, the space between doses. It was the biggest meeting of my career, a presentation to the entire executive board on the new quarterly strategy. This was it. The reason I had this job. The culmination of my new life. The charisma, the confidence, the witty comebacks. It was all a performance, and this was the main stage. I was in a rush that morning, a nervous energy I hadn't felt in months. I'd scooped my morning dose as usual, but my hands were shaking just enough that I must have miscalculated. I didn't even notice. I just drank the sour water and walked out the door, feeling ready. The presentation started perfectly. The words flowed. I was articulate, funny, in complete control. I made eye contact with the CEO, and he was smiling, nodding. I felt that familiar, invincible warmth. For the first 20 minutes, I was flying. Then, as I was clicking to a slide on market projections, I felt it. A faint electric hum starting behind my eyes. I tasted metal, like my mouth was full of old pennies. I tried to ignore it, to push through, but my heart gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I thought to myself, "Oh no, not now. Please, not now." I looked up from my laptop at the faces around the long, polished table. The world started to feel thin. I was looking at the chief financial officer, but his face looked wrong. It was like a mask that was too tight. His eyes seemed to sink back into his skull. When he smiled, it was a stretched, unnatural grin. I glanced at the CEO. His friendly expression had melted away. His eyes were black, not dark brown, but completely black, like two holes in his face. He started to speak, asking a question about the data on the screen, but the words weren't English. It was a low, guttural hissing. All of them were looking at me. Their faces were pale and waxy, their smiles showing too many teeth. The hum in my head became a deafening shriek. The room felt like an oven. I knew then, I knew what they were. They weren't executives. They were demons, wearing human suits, and they had lured me here. They were conspiring against me. This wasn't a boardroom. It was a trap. I started backing away from the podium, my hands held up. I think I was trying to say something, but no words came out. The CEO stood up, and his human shape seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. He was coming for me. A sound tore out of my throat. It wasn't a word. It was a raw animal scream of pure terror. I turned and ran. I slammed my shoulder into the heavy door, fumbled with the handle for a horrible second, and then burst out into the hallway. I didn't stop screaming. I just ran, my feet pounding on the carpet, leaving my career and my life and everything I had built behind me in that room with them. I don't remember how I got home from the office. I just remember the feeling of cold air on my face and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my own floor, my back against the locked front door, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. The call from HR came that afternoon. It was short. They said there had been a serious incident. They asked if I was okay, but it wasn't a real question. It was a legal formality. They said I was terminated, effective immediately. They told me they would be sending my personal belongings by courier. 2 days later, a box showed up at my door. It was all my desk photos, my coffee mug, everything from the life I had built. I just left it by the door. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I later heard from a former co-worker that I had become a story they told new hires. The guy who had a psychotic break in the middle of a board meeting. My old prison, the apartment I hid in from social anxiety, was my prison again. But this time, it was different. I wasn't trapped by a fear of people anymore. I was trapped by a fear of the rebound. The thought of being in public, in a grocery store, or even on the sidewalk, when the bottom dropped out of my reality, was a new kind of terror. What if I started screaming again? What if I saw demons in the faces of strangers? So I stayed inside. The 6-hour clock was still running, but now it was the only thing my life consisted of. Wake up in terror, dose. Stare at the walls, heart pounding, waiting for the first sign of the rebound. Dose again. Try to sleep, but wake up in a cold sweat 2 hours before the alarm, my body already screaming for the next dose. The phenibut didn't bring confidence anymore. It didn't bring anything good. All it did was push the psychosis away for a few more hours. My social anxiety was gone. That was true. But it had been replaced by something infinitely worse. The chemical had rewritten my fear. It wasn't about what other people might think of me. It was a deep, physical certainty that my own brain would betray me, that reality would tear apart at any moment, and that I would be left alone, screaming in a world that no one else could see. The cure had turned my mind into a haunted house, and I was locked inside. The real haunting didn't start until they were gone. The home invasion itself was a blur of noise and terror. The sound of the back window shattering, the yelling, the feeling of being completely, utterly powerless while strangers tore my world apart. But when the police left and the silence returned, that's when the ghosts moved in. Sleep was the first thing to go. I'd close my eyes and see a man's face, or hear the glass breaking again on a loop. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. During the day, I was a raw, exposed nerve. Every car door that slammed on the street was them coming back. Every shadow in the corner of my eye was a person standing there. I was a prisoner in my own home, terrified of the sounds and the silence, in equal measure. I went to therapy. I talked and talked and talked. For a year, I sat in a comfortable chair across from a kind woman and recounted every horrible detail. She called it exposure therapy. But it didn't feel like healing. It felt like I was just re-traumatizing myself every week for a fee. Talking about it didn't make the fear smaller. It just gave it more air, more space to grow. It did nothing. So I started looking for a different kind of help. I spent my nights online, in forums and on blogs, reading about PTSD. That's where I first found the stories. People who had been through wars, horrible accidents, assaults. People who were as broken as I was. They were all talking about the same thing, ayahuasca. They didn't call it a drug. They called it the medicine. They said it wasn't a trip, it was a ceremony. A spirit that shows you the root of your trauma and helps you heal it. I read hundreds of stories. People describing how one night with the medicine did more than a decade of therapy. It was a spiritual cure, a last resort that actually worked. I found a center deep in the Amazon. It was a week-long retreat. It was expensive. It would cost me every dollar I had in my savings. But I was desperate. The idea of living another 40 years as this shaking, terrified ghost was so much more horrifying than risking it all. I sent them the money. I put all my faith, everything I had left, into a plant. I was going to South America to let a sacred medicine either cure me or break me completely. We sat in a circle on woven mats in a large, round hut. The air was thick with incense and the sound of the jungle at night. The shaman, a small, quiet man, sang a low, rhythmic song as he went around the circle, handing each of us a small cup. It was filled with a dark, sludgy liquid. It smelled like dirt and bile. When my turn came, I drank it down in one go. The taste was worse than the smell. I had to fight my body's immediate urge to throw it back up. Then, I just lay back on my mat in the darkness and waited for something to happen. For almost an hour, nothing did. Just the familiar knot of fear in my stomach and the thought that I had made a terrible, expensive mistake. That this was another dead end. Then a warmth began to spread from my chest outwards. The sounds from the jungle became sharper, more detailed. The shaman's song was no longer just a sound. It felt like a physical vibration in the air. I felt a wave of nausea, and I purged into the bucket beside me, violently. The shaman had said this was the beginning of the cleansing. Afterwards, lying back, I didn't feel sick anymore. I felt empty. I felt clean. When I closed my eyes again, the darkness was gone. It was replaced by a river of intricate, neon-colored geometric patterns, folding and unfolding into each other. It was beautiful, not frightening. And then a presence began to gather in the center of the visuals. It wasn't something I saw as much as I felt. It was an overwhelming, powerful feeling of unconditional love, like a mother's embrace magnified 1,000 times. I knew, without being told, that this was her. This was the spirit of the medicine, Madre Ayahuasca. She didn't speak to me in words. She guided me. She took me back to the night of the home invasion. I saw the whole thing again, every terrifying detail. But this time, it was different. I wasn't alone in the memory. I felt her presence wrapped around me like a warm, protective blanket. I could see the events unfold, but I didn't feel the terror. The fear couldn't touch me. She was showing me my trauma from a place of complete safety and love. She showed me the fear itself, what it looked like inside my body. It was a tangled black knot of energy clenching my heart and stomach. She showed me how I had been holding on to it, feeding it. Then she showed me how to let it go. It was as simple as breathing. With every exhale, she guided me to release a strand of the knot. I felt the pain physically leaving my body, flowing out of me not as tears, but as a dark, heavy energy that dissolved into nothing. When it was over, the knot was gone. The silence that followed was the most profound peace I have ever known. The hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threats, the raw nerve that had been my existence for years, it was all just gone. I felt quiet. I felt whole. I just lay there in the dark, bathed in that incredible maternal love, and cried tears of pure, unburdened relief. I surrendered completely. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was safe. The next night, I couldn't wait. I went into the second ceremony with a wide, open heart. I was ready to go deeper, to be healed more completely. I drank the cup eagerly, the foul taste barely registering. I lay back on my mat, closed my eyes, and waited for the mother's love to return. And it did. The warmth spread through my chest. The familiar neon visuals bloomed behind my eyes. I felt her presence arrive, that same overwhelming feeling of safety and unconditional love. For a little while, it was pure bliss. I surrendered to it completely, feeling grateful, feeling saved. Then, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The warmth at the center of my chest didn't disappear, it was just drawn away, like a blanket being pulled back slowly. The beautiful, flowing patterns became sharp and angular. The embracing feeling was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical observation. The presence was still there, massive and powerful, but it was no longer a mother. It felt ancient, neutral, and then predatory. I felt like a small animal that had been happily nesting in a warm den, only to realize the den was the mouth of a snake. I didn't hear words. I was given an understanding, downloaded directly into my soul. She, the entity, showed me the first night. She showed me my own healing, the untangling of the black knot of fear. She showed me the hope and relief that followed. It was a bright, pure light inside of me. Then I felt her lean in. I felt her feeding on that light, drinking my hope like it was water. The healing wasn't a gift. It was a tactic. It was to fatten me up, to make me produce the most potent, flavorful hope just so she could consume it. The love I felt wasn't real. It was the way a farmer pets a pig before the slaughter. The moment I understood this, the terror returned 1,000 times worse than before. And she began her real work. The sound of the window shattering exploded in my head, louder and sharper than I had ever remembered it. I was back in my house on that night, but the protective blanket was gone. I was alone, and the fear was a physical thing, a cold fire burning through my veins. I saw the man's face. I felt the paralysis. I heard the screaming. Then it ended. The scene cut to black. And then it started again. The sound of the glass, the man's face, the screaming, and again, and again. It was an infinite loop. I was trapped inside the worst moment of my life, and she was holding me there, forcing my eyes open. I could feel her amusement, a cold, detached, cosmic laughter that wasn't a sound, but a vibration of pure sadism. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't healing. This was entertainment, and I was the main attraction. The loop of the breaking window and the screaming stopped. I hung in a black, silent void, and the silence was more terrifying than the noise. The cold, sadistic amusement was still there, but it was quiet now. It was waiting. I could feel it studying me, not with eyes, but with a pressure that was everywhere at once. Then I felt something new. It wasn't a memory being replayed. It was a feeling of being searched. It was like phantom fingers were digging through my mind, rifling through the filing cabinets of my entire life. It was looking for something. It found one. It pulled out a memory I hadn't thought of in years. Me on a swing set when I was a child. I could feel the sun on my face, the wind in my hair, the pure, simple joy of being pushed higher and higher by my father. It was a perfect, untouchable moment. And then I felt the entity touch it. The memory curdled. The sun went cold. My father's loving face twisted into a leering, monstrous grin. The chains of the swing became rusted and sharp, cutting into my hands. The feeling of joy was replaced with a deep, chilling dread. It took a piece of my childhood, a piece of my foundation, and turned it into another horror to be replayed. Then it started pulling more. My first day of school, a family vacation to the beach, the first time I held my nephew. One by one, it pulled the threads of my life, the good and the simple, and dipped them in poison. It wasn't just showing me my trauma anymore. It was raiding the rest of my soul for new material. It was rewriting me. I felt myself coming apart. Like I was a book and it was tearing out the pages, burning some, scribbling horrible things on others. I tried to think of my own name, to hold on to it as an anchor, but the name felt foreign. It was just a collection of sounds with no meaning. I felt my sense of I starting to thin out, dissolving into the cold, ancient darkness of the thing that was consuming me. This was the full realization. This wasn't a plant spirit. This wasn't medicine. This was an intelligence, a predator, a cosmic parasite. I hadn't found a healer. I had found something that eats souls, and I had willingly laid myself down on its dinner plate. My trauma wasn't a wound it was interested in healing. It was just the opening it had used to get inside. And now it had everything. It had my entire life to play with. Forever. I don't know how long I was in that black void, being disassembled. It felt like an eternity, but it also felt like no time had passed at all. The parasite was getting bored with me. The active torment stopped, and I was just dropped. I felt a sense of immense, ancient indifference, the way you might feel about an insect you finished pulling the legs off of. It was moving on. Then I felt something else, a dull, throbbing pain in my head, the sound of birds chirping, the feeling of a rough, woven mat against my cheek. I opened my eyes. Gray morning light was filtering into the hut. The shaman was gone. The other people were just starting to stir, moaning softly. The ceremony was over. I sat up. My body felt hollow, like a scooped-out melon rind. The fear was gone, but so was everything else. There was no love, no hope, no joy. Just a flat, dead, silent emptiness. I tried to think of my father on the swing set. The memory came, but it was ruined. I could see his face, but now it was a dead-eyed mask. The feeling of joy was gone, replaced by the ghost of that cold, leering dread the entity had covered it with. I tried to think of the beach, of my nephew, of anything good. It was all the same. The memories were there, like corrupted files on a hard drive, but the emotion attached to them had been scraped out and replaced with something awful. I had gone to the jungle to heal the one great trauma of my life. I left with my entire life turned into a trauma. The entity didn't just make me relive the home invasion. It planted its poison in every good thing I had ever known. It had taken my past, my foundation. It had won. Looking back on it now, I see the thread that connects my story to the others. We were all looking for a miracle, a secret key, an escape hatch from a pain that felt unbearable. The man with the panic attacks just wanted the terror to stop, and the doctor handed him a prescription that promised peace. But it cost him his mind. The woman trying to escape the physical hell of opiate withdrawal found an all-natural herb that promised a painless off-ramp. But it just drove her faster toward a different kind of seizure. The kid, crippled by social anxiety, found a legal powder online that promised charisma, but it led him to a psychotic break that shattered his life. And I, haunted by my past, went looking for a spirit to heal me. I found one. We all bought the same lie, the promise of the easy way out, the miracle cure that doesn't ask you to do the hard work. But there is no escape hatch. There are only other, deeper traps. The chemical, the plant, the powder, the spirit. They aren't solutions. They are just heavier locks for bigger cages. They don't kill the monster you're running from. They just transform it into something new. Something you don't understand, something that gets inside you, and something that may never, ever let you go.